March 9, 1945. The Mariana Islands. 5:30 p.m. The briefing room on Saipan was silent. 300 aircraft commanders sat in rows, sweating in the tropical heat. At the front of the room stood General Curtis LeMay. He was chomping on a cigar. He looked like a bulldog. "Gentlemen," LeMay growled. "Tonight, we are going to burn Tokyo." The pilots shifted uncomfortably. They knew the target. They knew the defenses. Tokyo was the most heavily defended city in the Japanese Empire. But then LeMay dropped the bombshell. "You're going in low," he said. 5,000 feet. A murmur of disbelief went through the room. The B-29 Superfortress was a high-altitude bomber. It was designed to fly at 30,000 feet, above the flak, above the fighters. Flying a B-29 at 5,000 feet over Tokyo was suicide. At that height, even small arms fire could hit them. LeMay continued. "And you're going in stripped. No guns. No ammo. We're taking out the turrets to save weight." Now the pilots were terrified. He was sending them into the heart of the enemy capital, low and unarmed. Instead of guns, LeMay said, "You're carrying napalm. 6 tons of it per plane. You will go in single file. You will drop your loads. And you will not stop until the city is gone." March 10, 1945. Tokyo. Midnight. The air raid sirens began to wail. But the citizens of Tokyo weren't too worried. They were used to B-29s flying high overhead, missing their targets in the jet stream winds. They called them Bison, Mr. B. A nuisance but not a threat. Then the first Pathfinder planes arrived. They didn't drop explosives. They dropped canisters of napalm that burst into flaming crosses on the ground, marking the target zone in the Shitamachi district, a dense warren of wood and paper houses. Then came the main force. 300 massive, silver bombers roared overhead, so low the Japanese civilians could see the rivets on their bellies. The bombs fell. They were M69 incendiary clusters. Each bomb broke open in midair, releasing dozens of smaller bomblets. When they hit the ground, they spit out a glob of jellied gasoline that burned at 1,000 degrees. Within minutes, the wooden city was an inferno. The fires joined together to create a firestorm, a man-made hurricane of heat. The superheated air rose so fast it sucked in oxygen from the surrounding streets, creating winds of 50 miles per hour that ripped trees out of the ground and sucked people into the flames. The canals boiled. The asphalt melted. High above, the B-29 crews were horrified. The updrafts from the fire were so strong that 60-ton bombers were tossed around like leaves. The smell of burning wood and burning flesh penetrated the pressurized cabins of the aircraft. One pilot looked down and saw the Sumida River. It was clogged with bodies. "It looked like a river of logs," he later said. But they weren't logs. That night, 100,000 people died in Tokyo. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history. Deadlier than Dresden, deadlier than Hiroshima, deadlier than Nagasaki. The Japanese military had ignored the high-altitude bomber. They thought they were safe. They didn't realize that the Americans had changed the rules. They didn't realize that the machine flying above them wasn't just a bomber anymore. It was an exterminator. This is the story of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It is the story of the most expensive weapon project of World War II, costing more than the atomic bomb. It is the story of a plane that was a disaster, an engineering nightmare that killed its own test pilots and engines that caught fire if you looked at them wrong. And it is the story of how a ruthless general took a broken weapon and used it to burn an empire to the ground. This is Forgotten Thunder. To understand the B-29, you have to understand the ambition of the United States in 1940. Even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Air Corps knew that war was coming. And they knew that the distances in the Pacific were vast. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the hero of the European War, didn't have the range to bomb Japan. General Hap Arnold wanted a hemisphere defense weapon. A bomber that could take off from the U.S., bomb an enemy fleet in the middle of the ocean, and return. He issued a requirement that sounded impossible. Range, 5,000 miles. Speed, 400 miles per hour. Bomb load, 20,000 pounds. Boeing accepted the challenge. They proposed the Model 345. It was a monster. It was twice as heavy as a B-17. It had a wingspan of 141 feet. But the most revolutionary feature was invisible: pressurization. In a B-17, the crew flew at 25,000 feet in unpressurized cabins. They wore bulky sheepskin suits to keep from freezing in the -40-degree air. They wore oxygen masks that froze to their faces. If a gunner took off his glove to clear a jam, his hand would frostbite in seconds. The B-29 changed everything. Boeing designed a pressurized fuselage. Inside, the air was warm and breathable. The crew could fly in shirt sleeves. They could move around. It was a spaceship. To defend it, they installed a revolutionary computer-controlled gun system. In a B-17, the gunners physically held the heavy .50 caliber machine guns. In a B-29, the gunners sat in comfortable chairs, looking through periscopes. They used a joystick to aim. An analog computer, a miracle of gears and cams, calculated the lead, the wind, and the gravity, and remotely moved the turrets outside. It was the most sophisticated machine ever built. The U.S. government went all in. They ordered 1,600 of them before the prototype had even flown. The cost was staggering. The Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, cost $2 billion. The B-29 project cost $3 billion. It was the biggest gamble in military history. And it almost failed. The problem was the engines. To lift this massive plane, they needed massive power. They chose the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone. It was an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,200 horsepower. It was a masterpiece of power, but a disaster of reliability. The engine was pushed to its absolute limit. It was built with magnesium crankcases to save weight. Magnesium is highly flammable. The engines had a fatal flaw. The top cylinders didn't get enough airflow to cool them. They would overheat. The valves would swallow. The cylinder would crack. And then the magnesium would ignite. An engine fire in a B-29 wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a blowtorch. The fire would burn through the wing spar in seconds, severing the wing and killing the crew. February 18, 1943. Seattle. The second prototype B-29 took off for a test flight. On board was Eddie Allen, Boeing's chief test pilot, the man who knew more about the plane than anyone. 20 minutes into the flight, an engine caught fire. Allen turned back to Boeing Field. The fire spread. It burned through the electrical system, cutting power to the cockpit. It burned through the wing. The massive bomber crashed into a meatpacking plant in Seattle. Eddie Allen, his entire crew, and 19 civilians on the ground were killed. The program was in crisis. The engines were death traps. The computer guns didn't work. The windows blew out under pressure. Washington panicked. Senators called it a boondoggle. They wanted to cancel it. But General Hap Arnold refused. He knew that without the B-29, there was no way to bomb Japan. He ordered them to fix it. They built a modification center in Kansas. It became known as the Battle of Kansas. In the freezing winter of 1944, mechanics worked outdoors in blizzards, modifying the engines, adding baffles, changing carburetors. They didn't fix it completely. The R-3350 would remain a temperamental beast for the entire war. But they made it flyable. The gamble continued. The planes were deployed to India and China. The Matterhorn project had begun. The initial plan was to bomb Japan from bases in China. It was a logistical nightmare. Everything, fuel, bombs, spare parts, had to be flown over the Himalayas, the hump, from India. It took 7 gallons of fuel to deliver 1 gallon of fuel to the forward bases. On June 15, 1944, the first B-29 raid on Japan took place. The target was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works in Yoda. It was a fiasco. 75 B-29s took off. 7 crashed on takeoff or had engine failures before reaching the target. When they arrived over Japan, they encountered a new enemy, the jet stream. The B-29s were bombing from 30,000 feet. At that altitude, over Japan, they hit winds of 200 miles per hour. The Norden bomb sight, the miracle computer that could drop a pickle in a pickle barrel, couldn't handle it. The bomber would be flying at 300 miles per hour, but with a 200 miles per hour tailwind, its ground speed was 500 miles per hour. The bomb sight couldn't calculate the drop angle. The bombs fell miles off target. They hit rice paddies. They hit the ocean. They hit nothing. Of the 75 planes, only one bomb hit the factory complex. One bomb. The Japanese looked up at the silver contrails high in the sky and laughed. They realized the Americans couldn't hit them. The Superfortress was a super failure. For months, the B-29s tried precision bombing. They tried to hit aircraft factories. They tried to hit docks. The results were pathetic. Accuracy was less than 5%. General Arnold was furious. He had spent $3 billion and he had nothing to show for it. He fired the commander of the B-29 force. He needed a man who didn't care about doctrine. He needed a man who didn't care about safety. He needed a killer. He sent for Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was the youngest general in the Army Air Forces. He was 38. He was a hard, cold, pragmatic man. He didn't smile. He led from the front. In Europe, he had personally flown the lead bomber on the most dangerous missions to stop his pilots from aborting. LeMay arrived in the Marianas, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, in January 1945. The B-29s had moved there from China to be closer to Japan. He looked at the results. They were terrible. He analyzed the problem. 1. The jet stream at 30,000 feet was making accuracy impossible. 2. The Japanese weather was always cloudy, blocking the bomb sites. 3. The B-29 engines were overheating trying to climb to high altitude with heavy bomb loads. LeMay realized that precision bombing, the American doctrine of hitting specific factories, was failing. He looked at Japanese cities. Unlike German cities, which were built of stone and brick, Japanese cities were built of wood, bamboo, and paper. And the factories weren't just big industrial parks. Japan used shadow factories, small workshops in people's homes that made parts for airplanes. The target wasn't a building. The target was the city itself. LeMay made a decision that would change the moral calculus of the war. He decided to switch to incendiary bombing. Fire. And he decided to change the tactics completely. No more high altitude, he said. We go in low. 5,000 to 8,000 feet. At that altitude, there was no jet stream. The engines wouldn't overheat. The accuracy would be perfect. No more daylight, he said. We go at night. The Japanese defenses were weak at night. Their radar was poor. Their night fighters were almost non-existent. And then, the wildest order of all, strip the guns. LeMay ordered the removal of all defensive guns and ammunition, except the tail gun. He kicked the gunners off the planes. Removing the guns and ammo saved 3,000 pounds. That meant 3,000 more pounds of napalm bombs per plane. His pilots thought he was insane. You're sending us in low, at night, unarmed? It's suicide. LeMay told them, if you're afraid, I'll lead the mission myself. But if you don't go, I'll court-martial you. The date was set. March 9, 1945. Operation Meeting House. Target, Tokyo. On the afternoon of March 9th, the B-29s taxied out on the coral runways of Tinian and Saipan. They were heavy, groaning under the weight of 6 to 8 tons of incendiaries. Inside the bomb bays were clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. The M69 was a sinister invention. It looked like a pipe. Inside, it held a cheesecloth sock filled with napalm, jellied gasoline. When it hit a roof, a delayed fuse would ignite a charge that spat the burning napalm out, sticking to walls, floors, and furniture. It was designed specifically to burn down Japanese houses. 334 B-29s took off. They flew north, low over the dark Pacific. They arrived over Tokyo just after midnight. The Pathfinders, the lead planes, dropped their bombs first. They aimed for a specific rectangle in the Shitamachi district, the most densely populated area of the city. 100,000 people per square mile lived there in wooden houses. The Pathfinders dropped their napalm in a perfect X shape. A flaming cross in the darkness. Target marked. The radio crackled. Then the main force arrived. It was a conveyor belt of destruction. For 3 hours, a B-29 passed over the target every 50 seconds. They opened their bays. The clusters fell. They broke open at 2,000 feet, raining thousands of hissing, flaming tubes onto the city. The effect was apocalyptic. Fires started everywhere. Hundreds, then thousands. Within 30 minutes, the individual fires joined together. This created a firestorm. A firestorm is a weather event. The heat is so intense that it creates a thermal column of rising air. This vacuum sucks in fresh air from the surrounding area at hurricane speeds. Winds of 50 to 70 miles per hour ripped through the streets of Tokyo. But it wasn't wind, it was fire. People running for their lives were picked up by the wind and thrown into the flames. Fire trucks were flipped over. The water in the canals boiled. The B-29 crews at 5,000 feet felt the heat. Their planes were tossed upward by the thermals. The smoke filled the cockpits. Crews reported vomiting from the smell of burning flesh. One tail gunner looked down and saw the city glowing red. It looked like looking into the mouth of a volcano, he said. On the ground it was hell. Civilians rushed to the bridges to escape. The bridges caught fire. They jumped into the Sumida River. The heat was so intense the water suffocated them or boiled them. By dawn, the raid was over. The B-29s turned back to the Marianas. The sun rose over a wasteland. 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. Burned to ash. Over 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. The Japanese government was stunned. They had prepared for high-altitude precision raids. They had dug air raid shelters. But the shelters became ovens. The fire sucked the oxygen out of them, suffocating everyone inside. General LeMay looked at the reconnaissance photos. He didn't celebrate. He planned the next one. 2 days later, they burned Nagoya. 2 days after that, Osaka. Then Kobe. In 10 days, LeMay's fire blitz destroyed nearly 40% of Japan's urban area. The B-29, the plane that was mocked as a failure, had become the Grim Reaper. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a ruin. The B-29s roamed the skies with impunity. They dropped mines in the harbors, cutting off all food imports. They dropped leaflets warning cities they were next on the list. But the Japanese refused to surrender. They prepared for the invasion, Operation Downfall. They armed civilians with bamboo spears. The U.S. wanted to end it without an invasion. They had one final card to play. The silver-plate B-29s. These were specially modified superfortresses. They had new engines with fuel injection. They had rapid-opening bomb bay doors. They were built for one mission, to carry a single, massive bomb. August 6, 1945. Colonel Paul Tibbets throttled up the B-29 named Enola Gay. In its belly was Little Boy, a uranium bomb. The mission profile was exactly what the B-29 was designed for, high altitude. 30,000 feet. Tibbets flew to Hiroshima. The weather was clear. The jet stream was calm. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors snapped open. The bomb fell. The B-29 executed a sharp diving turn to escape the blast wave. 43 seconds later, a flash brighter than the sun lit up the cockpit. A shockwave hit the plane, rattling it like a tin can. The tail gunner, Bob Karen, looked back. A mushroom cloud, he recorded. Bubbling purple and gray, the city is covered in smoke. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio. The war was over. The B-29 had delivered the final blow. It had started the war as a technological disaster and ended it as the destroyer of worlds. The B-29 Superfortress was a marvel. It pioneered pressurized flight. It pioneered remote control guns. It paved the way for modern airliners. The Boeing 707 and 747 trace their lineage directly to the B-29. But its legacy is haunted by the smoke of Tokyo. General LeMay was unrepentant. Years later, he said, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. But all war is immoral. If you're going to fight, you might as well win." The B-29 proved that industrial might could overcome any defense. Japan laughed at the early raids. They thought the distance was too great, the winds too strong, the bombers too inaccurate. They didn't count on the adaptability of the American war machine. When precision failed, they switched to brute force. When high altitude failed, they went low. The high-altitude bomber ended up winning the war at 5,000 feet, with its bomb bay doors open, raining fire on an empire that had underestimated it. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.